So, can you tell me a little bit about where you were born?
Yes, in mid-America, and it was, 1913 was just the beginning of World War I. Mm-hmm. So that's where my life goes back to, is World War I.
All right. And so, can you tell me a little bit about growing up in that time and around the Depression in that era?
Yes, there was no paved roads, practically no vehicles of any kind, horse and buggy, and no radio, no TV, no satellites. And so I lived in a small community, and the church was the center of our social and cultural life, and real community spirit. Everybody helped everybody else, mostly farmers. Mm-hmm. And every year when it came harvest season, all the farmers would go together, no money changed hands. Everybody just helped everybody until all their crops were harvested. Real community. That's
right. And so then, can you tell me about what happened leading up to when you enlisted in 1932?
Yes. I graduated from high school in 1932, mm-hmm. and that was the height of the Depression. My older brother and sister were both college graduates, and absolutely no employment of any kind available. In fact, most college graduates that had income, or at least many of them, either sold apples or pencils on the street corner. That's the only employment they could get. So about the only escape from this small community to be on my own, and economic on my own, was the military. So there was a waiting list to get in the Navy of about 8 months. And the substation in my home area, Hannibal, Missouri, only took 2 candidates a month. So right out of high school, I went down, signed up to enlist in the Navy, figuring I'd have about 8 months to think it over and change my mind if I found something else. But it happened that the person ahead of me had scored 100 on the entrance exam. My score was 98. I was in perfect physical condition. Mm-hmm. So the recruiting officer said, I'm putting you two on the top of the list. So within 3 weeks after I'd signed up, instead of having waiting time, I was on the top of the list and entered the Navy then.
Wow. So then what were some of your first assignments then after you enlisted?
After recruit training, I went aboard the newest battleship of the Navy, the USS West Virginia, operating off California, and I actually spent the next 10 years of my life on that battleship. And during that time, the Navy in the 30s was a traveling Navy, and part of its job was to show the flag around the world. So we traveled in both oceans. So we were traveling Navy all the way from New York to Seattle every year, almost every year.
So can you describe what life was like on the USS West Virginia?
Well, it was the last of the World War I battleships, the newest of those ships. And electronics were practically non-existent. It wasn't very sophisticated. We had electricity and hydraulic power to operate the guns. There was no radar. And it's pretty leisurely life. You can't imagine a period without satellites, without radio, without any kind of communication, cell phones or anything. So we were very proficient at firing our guns, our 16-inch guns, and our 5-inch guns, and our aircraft guns, but no scientific method of controlling, just practically aimed at the thing with a gun sight, and that was it. If you couldn't see it, you couldn't shoot at it. Mm-hmm. Now, for long range, we shoot over the horizon, and so we would have an airplane. We carried airplanes on the ship, and they could go up and do the spotting and tell us where our splice was coming down. Mm-hmm. Actually, to be accurate in those days, what you did was computed the best information you had, and then you'd shoot and see where the splice was relative to the target. Then you could, ideally, you'd shoot over and under, and keep moving up and down until you got this target in the center. Not very scientific. You see, you could figure out a few things, but the one thing you couldn't figure out is the distance from your ship to the target. So you had to guess at that. Well, when radar came along, and you knew the exact distance to the ship, why our efficiency greatly improved. But we were a little improvement over John Paul Jones. But compared to today, pretty primitive in the way we controlled our weapons.
Mm-hmm. So, what was your specific duty on board the ship?
Well, everybody has on a ship two duties. One is their battle station duty, which is the main reason they're there, is for their battle station, and the other is the maintenance of the ship, to keep it ready and ready for battle. So I was assigned to a gun turret, 16-inch guns. Each barrel of the gun weighs 105 tons, and projectile weighs over 2,000 pounds, and can be fired about 21 miles. That's quite a big piece of equipment. So it is actually we have a short range and a long range battle practice. The short range is at 1 mile, and you shoot with a telescope at a visible target. And the gun is fired by pulling the trigger, like you would on a rifle or shotgun. And my first job, battle station, was the firing pointer, to shoot the gun in there as just a little over being a teenager that had that. I actually did all the jobs that is done in a gun turret. There's a crew of about 20 people maintain that all the time. So that was my first job around that. Later I had other jobs on the ship. I later became the postmaster on the ship. And whenever we got near shore, we would use one of our airplanes to take the mail in or pick up mail. So for about 3 years, I rode an airplane, every time it went in. And we went off a catapult, go from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 60 feet. But you have to land on the water. The plane had floats. And if the weather is rough, well, the landing was rough too on that. But those are some of my experiences that I had on the ship.
So at what time then did the ship move to Pearl Harbor?
We used to visit there every year from the West Coast. We were stationed in Los Angeles Harbor. But in 1940, we knew the Japanese were doing aggressive things in the Pacific. So the orders came from Washington on one of our routine trips to Hawaii to change our base from the West Coast to Hawaii. And that was 1940, the summer of 1940 when we moved.
And so you were permanently stationed there then, or you kept moving around the world?
No, we stayed pretty close there because actually some of our battleships were in the Atlantic, but we were pretty much there as a protection against Japan in the Pacific. Then once we moved out to Pearl Harbor, that was permanent. Yeah, we didn't do any traveling anyplace else except in and out of Pearl Harbor.
Did you ever expect an attack on Pearl Harbor?
We expected eventually hostile action between the U.S. and Japan. But as far as Pearl Harbor is concerned, aircraft carriers were a little bit new and novel. And actually, I think the records show that the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet had a high-level conference about 10 days before the attack. And he and his staff concluded that it was impossible for Japan to launch a carrier-based attack on Hawaii. we knew that the Japanese had designs on the Philippines. Actually, what their main objective was in World War II was to capture what they called the Southern Resources Area, which was Indonesia, Malaysia, and those countries where they needed rubber, tin, and oil. In order to take the rubber, tin, and oil back to Japan, they had to pass by the Philippines. As long as we had a military force in the Philippines, they couldn't be successful. So they knew that our plan for defending the Philippines involved the battleships. So they came to Pearl Harbor primarily to neutralize the battleships so they could get on with the invasion of the Philippines. Now, they used 360 aircraft. A lot of those were fighters, 140 with the first wave that had no opposition. And then they wanted to destroy all the aircraft on the ground so they wouldn't be followed back to their carriers. So a lot of their aircraft were bombing the 7 airfields on the island of Oahu. But the battleships were their main target. Of the 40 torpedoes they fired that morning, the exact figure, 40 they fired, 18 of them were fired, 9 at my ship and 9 at the ship next to it, the Oklahoma, which capsized it. So we took 18 of the 40 they got that morning.
18?
Yeah. The 2 ships, we took 9, right. The other ship took 9.
So, can you describe to me what you were doing that morning and how you felt?
Yes, well, I might have not been here if it hadn't been for the circumstances. But we were married in Hawaii, July. So we were newlyweds. And we were associated with a Christian group called the Navigators. And they had a big home in Hawaii. And Saturday night, about 120 servicemen into a meeting. Well, the director and his wife were away for the weekend. My wife and I were standing in for them. So we had this big meeting on Saturday night. And my wife was fixing breakfast for about 8 military people Sunday morning. And while we were around the breakfast table between 7:30 and 8, we began to hear these explosions. Now, it was not unusual to hear gunfire on a Sunday morning because the Army was building up gun sites around the island, and they tested them every Sunday morning. So we could hear gunfire every Sunday morning, so that was not unusual. Mm-hmm. It was not unusual to see Army aircraft flying around. Just always lots of them there. So we heard the explosions. Now, my reaction was, it was rumored that the Japanese battleship Graf Spee was in the Pacific and that she was being chased by 3 British cruisers. So the minute I heard the explosions, I said, the British cruisers have caught up with the Graf Spee and she's coming into neutral harbor under international law. A ship being pursued can come into a neutral harbor with as a safety measure, but they either have to surrender within 24 hours or get back into combat. So that was my first reaction. Well, at about that time, an aircraft shell that hadn't gone off exploded in our backyard and drew a crater about 25 feet across. So one of our fellows at the home there had a car, and we turned on the radio. Of course, when I heard these explosions, Webley Edwards, who was the owner of the station and the MC that morning, said, we have been advised by Army and Navy intelligence that the island of Oahu is under enemy attack, and said the enemy has not been identified. Stay tuned for further information. So we got in the car, the ones of us there at the house, and headed for the harbor. Well, then got a next radio message. It said the enemy has been identified as Japan. All military people returned to bases. We were already on our way. So I missed the first 20 minutes of the actual attack on the way down the harbor. Now, the majority of the damage that was done that morning to the ships was done in the first 11 minutes of the attack. And by the time I got to the ship, it had taken these 9 torpedoes, been hit with a couple 2,000-pound bombs. Pearl Harbor is a shallow harbor, and where we were moored, it was only 40 feet deep. A battleship draws about 35 feet when it's loaded, so we only had 5 feet of water under us. So the ship sunk pretty rapidly, just set down in the mud. Of course, it listed precariously, but the crew on board counter-flooded, so it set down upright in the mud. The ship ahead of us, Oklahoma, that took 9 torpedoes, it did not counter-flood, and it capsized. So here it was. The first thing I saw was the bottom of the Oklahoma, right ahead of my ship, and my ship was sitting on the bottom. We'd lost all electrical power, so nothing we could do. We depend on electrical power to operate everything on the ship. So I got back to ship as soon as I could. Everything above the waterline was on fire. Since gunnery was my specialty, I knew where the ready ammunition, we always kept some ready ammunition topside. And I knew that if the fire got to those ammunition lockers, we were going to have further explosions. So I got a hose from the ship we were tied up, which was undamaged, it had water pressure, and tried to cool the ammunition lockers so it wouldn't go up. However, no matter how attentive you are, when you see bodies scattered around, that occupies your attention, particularly if they're wounded, and can be helped. So by that time, many of them had been removed, but with a fire hose in one hand, I went around looking at the various bodies to see if anybody alive. Now, the military had wisely equipped all of us with a metal name tag and a fireproof grommet around it, so it's easy to identify. So I was doing 3 things for the next several minutes. A fire hose in one hand, walking around looking at the name tags and trying to memorize them, as many as I could, knowing that the parents of those people who had been killed would never have any idea what happened. They'd just get a letter from the Navy Department. So being the postmaster, I had access to everybody's address, home address. So I memorized as many as I could with the idea of writing and telling them what happened to their son on that morning. Well, after about noon, we had the fires pretty well out, and the ship was sitting there without any power of any kind. So many of my friends had been badly burned, so I went over to the hospital to see them, and I don't know, probably nearly 100 guys from various ships in suspension, with their hair burned off and their faces bandaged, and most of them didn't have a chance to ever regain, 100% burn. So I took a pencil notebook and went up and down the line. I was going to do this with my shipmates, but everyone I stopped at, I said, if you will give me your parents' name and address and dictate just a couple of lines to them, why, I'll see the mail to them. So I spent all afternoon just taking messages from these mostly burned people in suspension to send to their families. We did not know if there was going to be a return attack, and I wasn't able to communicate with my wife, who was at home. And the Honolulu Police Department did not have radios in their cars. So they had to improvise. So the 2 radio stations were taken over to broadcast orders to the police. And so they ordered a complete blackout. Nobody could show a light or no car driving on the road, in case the Japanese were returning. So most of the civilians, including my wife, all they do is sit around and listen to the radio. And the police had taken over, so they'd just give orders, They'd get a report, well, somebody is stealing and somebody doing this. So it wasn't a very interesting conversation, which, in retrospect, a little ironic, because it blacked out the whole island. But the Arizona battleship that was hit the hardest at Pearl Harbor, the blaze was so great on that, it took 3 days to put it out. So it looked like a volcano erupting, so everything was blocked out except the torch that illuminated the center of the harbor there. But that was a good precaution, to not allow any lights at night, although that bright fire from the Arizona was quite a beacon for anybody who was looking for something there.
What did you think when you heard the declaration of war the next day against Germany and Japan?
When I enlisted in the Navy, I realized that the purpose of the Navy is to fight. And I thought that if I make a career of the Navy, I'll probably get involved in war sometime. So the minute the attack began, my reaction was, this is it. This is why I'm here. So I didn't know how long it'd take him back into Washington, but then our attitude that day was that we don't need a declaration of war. We're in war right now. And I'll just elaborate on that a little bit. That one of the strongest human characteristics is survival. One of the strongest instincts. And when I got back on the dock, these the Japanese sent in 140 fighters with the first wave that came in. They were all armed with machine guns and light bombs, expecting opposition. Well, there was practically no opposition. So they were a real nuisance. They had enough fuel for an hour or two on there. They flew around shooting at anything that moved. Just like a swarm of bees around there. You can imagine 100 and some aircraft just looking for targets of opportunity. Well, the first one that came close was flying so low that you could see the color of his eyes, the open cockpits on them. So the pilot banked so the machine gunner could zero in on some of us who were waiting there. And he didn't bank far enough, so the bullets went right over our heads and dug a trench right behind. Well, I'm glad that the pilot didn't bank a little further, it just cut us right in two there. But the war became pretty personal at that point. And, whatever your morality is, survival takes over. And if the only way you can preserve your own life is take somebody else's, that's the instinctive response to it. So it became very personal at that point.
Right.
I'd like to make another observation here that is not exploited much in history. There were 164 ships in Pearl Harbor that morning. That included small craft and several Coast Guard ships. But that's quite an armada of ships in the harbor. Only 20 were damaged. So most of the historical reports show the damage to the ships. But there were 144 ships of various sizes that did their duty. There were about 30 destroyers in port. 3 of them were damaged. The rest of them totally untouched. We were moored outboard of the battleship Tennessee. The battleship Tennessee fired every round of anti-aircraft ammunition they had on board that morning. So the historical record zeroes in on the devastation, but the actual record, the heroism of the people responding to their training. Now, we were at a great disadvantage, being in port like that and being surprised on that. But the initial report was that we shot down 55 of the Japanese planes that came in that morning. Actually, when they got an accurate record, it was only 28, because 2 ships had been firing at the same plane when it came down. Each one of them thought they'd brought down an airplane, but some on the same one, 28. But there was a lot of things done right that morning, by the 144 ships that were undamaged. So I think it needs to be in balance, the damage done. The Japanese were mainly going to immobilize the battleships and do all the damage they could to the fleet. And they did that because that's where the concentration was. One thing that happened is in our favor. There's always a strong breeze over Pearl Harbor, and generally offshore, coming from land going offshore. The Arizona, battleship Arizona, was at the end of the column, and when she was hit and all the fuel oil set on fire and the ammunition blew up and the ship burning, created a huge black smoke cloud, and it covered the other ships in there. So by the time the horizontal bombers came in, the high bombers, they couldn't see the targets. And I have one Japanese sketch of 50 pilots that had dropped their bombs on the battleships. 40 of them missed their target because they were covered with smoke in there. Only 2 direct hits on that one flight of 50 in that. As far as my personal feelings were concerned, there was a Navy tanker with that holds 6 million gallons of aviation fuel. And I thought it was loaded with fuel. It turns out later it was not fully loaded. But the captain decided to move out of his berth over to submarine base. So it was right in the center of that, of the formation of the big harbor. Well, these fighters kept strafing the ship. And I thought any minute one of them was going to generate enough spark to set that off. Now I know what a quart of gasoline will do. And I can imagine what 1 million gallons of gasoline would do, but probably more damage than was done that morning altogether. So personally, I had my life was right with God. I knew I was going to heaven when I died, and I had the feeling for about an hour and a half, I got 1 more minute to live. I got another minute to live. Another minute to live. That made the time pass very rapidly, just living minute to minute, expecting that ship to go up. And no escape from it right there. Well, I learned a lifelong lesson out of that. It's done me good. Maybe that's one reason I'm 95 and a half years old today and have the blood pressure of a teenager. That the lesson was, when there's real danger for the Christian, God's presence is very real. Well, it's almost like you're right there with him because you expect to be with him in just a few seconds. But if there's no danger, he doesn't show up. So most of our fears and imaginary dangers are not real. So as I've faced stressful situations in the future, I say now, this looks like a pretty dangerous situation, but I don't feel God's presence. And I say, if there were any danger, he'd be right here on the spot. I don't worry much. I have the blood pressure of a teenager at my age. So that's the lasting lesson that I've gotten out of it. I applied all my life in that, just how to deal with stress, It's not real. If it were, it'd be counteracted by that knowledge of God's presence. My wife hasn't said anything here, but it was a pretty sad day for the honeymooners. We expected to spend a long weekend together. I'd been to sea for 2 weeks, just came in on Friday. So once we knew what it was, I had to race down. And so as we said goodbye, never knew when we'd see each other again, why she quoted a verse of Scripture. Do you remember what that was to me?
The beloved of the Lord shall
be with me and underneath.
Underneath the everlasting arm.
And I shouted back a verse of Scripture to her. What was when I shouted back to her?
The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms.
So that's the way we parted. And of course we were occupied all the rest of the day. But since she had a Navy pass, she was able to come out Monday morning. So we saw each other again Monday morning. But one of the things that's untold about Pearl Harbor, each battleship carries more than 1 million gallons of crude oil. And the Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia lost all their crude oil. California quite a bit. So it was about a foot deep. Oil's lighter than water. Well, you know what a spoonful of oil will do. You can't get rid of it. So we were soaked, hair, bodies, and uniforms in fuel oil. And of course I hadn't shaved or combed my hair, so she saw me in this oil-soaked white uniform. And she was glad to see me, although that wasn't what she expected, but I'm still alive. And one of my friends, another survivor of the battleship, and he had a toothbrush. I didn't have one, so we used it for the same toothbrush for 2 or 3 days, so I was able to get another one in there.
So, what happened to the USS West Virginia after the attack?
Well, it was salvageable, but it didn't have priority, and so I had to stay there with the crew. And we salvaged the ship and got it afloat and ready to go back to the Navy Yard for overhaul and repair in 1943. My wife had to come home Christmas Day from Pearl Harbor.
And so day I ever was Christmas here.
And we were separated the next year and a half then. So we got back to Bremerton, Washington Navy Yard, 1943. I was immediately transferred to, had orders to another battleship, the South Dakota, and went to Washington to go to school on that. But the ship was repaired, got back in the war, and got the recognition for sinking a Japanese battleship in 1945, and toward the end of the war. Later, it was sold for scrap iron. So sometimes when somebody asks me what happened to West Virginia, I say, well, if you used a razor blade to shave with this morning, you might have used one came off the West Virginia. It was sold for scrap.
So what do you think that the nation could learn from the attack on Pearl Harbor in the future?
Yes, I think this is probably not original with me, but weakness invites aggression. And the Pearl Harbor survivors have a motto, remember Pearl Harbor, I've kind of added the motto, and my motto would be, remember Pearl Harbor, keep America strong. Human nature being what it is, there's always people that will take advantage of those that they are weaker than they are. And there will always be tyranny, I think. So that's the lesson to our nation from now on. One of the reasons I think that we were so vulnerable in World War II is that most of the World War I generation had passed on. We had very few political and military officers that had had combat experience. People who have not had combat experience are very optimistic. Couldn't happen. A person that's had combat experience is not optimistic. It can happen. And so they're ready and defensive. But we had very few, as I said, political military leaders with combat experience. So anytime there's a period where you've got people in charge of the military and political without combat experience, we're vulnerable. And they like to cut corners on the budget. But my advice is, keep your morale strong.